What's going on, everyone? It's Peter with the Garden Family, and today I'm gonna go over 7 mistakes that people often make when starting seeds. We garden in Southwest Ohio, planting zone 6B. We have a pretty large garden and start all of our vegetables from seed. Seed starting can be incredibly fun and rewarding. I almost look forward to seed starting season as much as I do to gardening season. But it also can be pretty frustrating if you do things incorrectly, because we put a lot of time, energy, and money into starting all these seeds. I've made my share of mistakes along the way, and here are the most common ones that either I have done or I have seen, so you don't have to make them. So the first one has to do with what you plant your seeds in, the soil or soilless mix that you pick. And the main mistake I see with this is people just go out to their garden, they grab a little bit of soil, stick it in a pot, bring it inside, and plant their seeds in there. Soil from outside has a lot of microorganisms in it, bacteria, fungi, and outside they sort of stay at a nice equilibrium and keep each other in check, but in a controlled environment indoors, those microorganisms can wreak havoc on your seedlings. So using outdoor soil puts your seedlings at risk for something called damping off, where those microorganisms attack the young tender seedling. You'll see it right at the stem, right where the soil meets the stem, and it sort of shrivels and then the seedlings die. So instead of using outdoor soil, you're going to want to use some sort of seed starting or soilless mix. We like the Pro Mix variety, but really anything that you go to a big box store and buy something for seed starting specifically will work great. So the second common mistake I see has to do with timing, and that's starting your cool weather plants too late. Unless you're on a very temperate coastal part of the United States, in general, there's a finite time where we have that cool weather that plants like broccoli, kale, lettuce, peas, those type of plants really prefer weather that is 70s or below and will not perform well once you get into the heat of summer. So for example, in Ohio, really by mid-May, we expect temperatures in the 80s. And so I want all of my cool weather plants to be maturing right around that time frame. And since most plants require about 2 months or so to mature, say a broccoli plant, we really have to try to get them in the ground by early April at the latest. And that means we have to start them here indoors mid-February, because they need about 6 weeks to be planted indoors prior to going outdoors. So one of the big errors I see is people are thinking they're going to plant their garden in May around Mother's Day, and then somewhere around early April, late March, they start their lettuces and their other cool weather plants. They get them in the ground only to have them not perform well as the weather heats up. So the third common mistake also has to do with timing, and that's planting your warm weather plants too early. Plants like tomatoes cannot withstand any sort of frost, which usually happens in the mid-30s, and they really don't do well if nighttime temperatures are below 50 degrees. So for example, we can usually plant our tomato plants out by the first or second week of May here in Southwest Ohio. Tomatoes grow relatively quickly. Generally, you don't want them indoors for more than 6 to 8 weeks. So if you can't plant them out until the middle of May, you really shouldn't start them until the middle of March. Now, this is a mistake we have made in the past, and part of the issue is a little bit with how last frost dates work. So technically our last frost date, I think, is April 23rd here, but that's really just sort of 50%. 50% of the time it'll be before then and 50% after. And of course, when you're babying your seedlings along, you don't want to be a flip of a coin whether or not they're going to die outside. And so you're usually planting things out a few weeks after that last frost date, just to ensure that you're not going to get a frost after they get planted out. So the error we made in the past is we said, okay, April 23rd, that's our last frost. Let's count 8 weeks or 2-ish months before that. So why don't we start these the end of February? So you get all of your tomatoes planted end of February. Well, April 23rd comes along, you look at the long-term forecast and you think, no, I can't plant these out. It looks like we might have a frost next week. You wait till the next week, another frost, possibly the next week, and now you have these just massive tomato plants that are really stressed in too small of containers. So nowadays, we actually don't plant our tomatoes until the very end of March or even early April. What I have found is a young, healthy, compact plant that's in a container that actually works with its root structure. Even if it's not really large, that plant is actually going to do better once you transplant it than something that you planted too early, it's root bound, or it just doesn't have enough light or nutrients to support the size plant that it is. All right, so common mistake number 4, also one that we have done. And that is to basically just put all of your plants in the same big tray. So for example, this right here, it's a 72 cell tray. And you know, nice size for a seedling commonly that you're gonna plant out. And what you might think is, oh great, I'll just buy one of those, my garden's not too big, and I'll put you know, eggplant here and peppers here and tomatoes here, etc. And then I can just transplant all of those out in this one compact form. So the problem with mix and matching different types of seeds in one tray is that they germinate at different times. So when you're starting seeds, often you plant them, you water them in, you place a humidity dome over the top of them to maintain the moisture and allow the seed to germinate. But if you have, say, peppers and tomatoes in the same 72 cell tray, what'll happen is 5-ish days in, your tomatoes will all germinate, and the peppers might still have a week or even 2 weeks before they germinate. Once a seed has germinated, you really don't want to leave the humidity dome on. A, it can cause disease, and B, the seedling's just going to run into the top of it. So you're sort of at this strange problem, no-win situation where your tomatoes have germinated. If you take the humidity dome off, you're going to have a really hard time keeping consistent moisture for the peppers. But if you leave a humidity dome on, it's going to hurt the tomatoes. So the solution to that is you can just break up the trays in there by seed type. So, you know, for example, here, if you had your tomatoes in this and your peppers in this, you could just take the tomatoes out, put them in a different tray, and then leave the humidity dome on. This is part of the reason why we actually start all of our seeds in these little to-go containers with their own humidity domes. It's just easier to give each type of seed the environment and the length of time it needs to germinate. So mistake number 5 is insufficient lighting. Seeds do require sufficient light for photosynthesis, and oftentimes the light that we have in our house is just not sufficient for good seedling growth. One of the things that you may have heard is to start your seeds in a south-facing window, and that can work, and it will work to support small seedlings. But you need to think a little bit about the length of day when you're starting your seeds, and also the amount of sunlight that you get in your area. So ideally, seedlings are getting either sun or artificial light for 14 to 16 hours a day. And so if we tried to start ours in a south-facing window, we only would get sunlight from that south-facing window, assuming it's sunny. It's very rarely sunny here in Ohio in the winter. But even if it was sunny, the day length is very short still because we're still in winter. And so we would still want to add some supplemental lighting. If you're just starting out and you're starting on a budget, you're probably buying lighting that you can just get from a big box store, such as fluorescent lighting like we have here. And with those type of lights, you really want to make sure your seedlings are very close to the light. These high-powered LEDs are meant to be 30 plus inches from the plants, but if I had fluorescent lights at this level, these would all be incredibly leggy. If you don't have very robust lighting in your seed starting room, you can still be successful, but I would err on the side of starting your seeds later and planting them out a little bit smaller. Young seedlings don't need quite as much light as, say, a bigger plant like these parsley that we have here. And so you're probably going to give it what it needs for those first few weeks of its life. But if you're trying to start really early and have your plant indoors for a few months, for example, it's just not going to do well, and it's going to be unhealthy and not do well once you plant it out either. Speaking of lighting, we did do a video kind of going over all of the things that we use here in our seed starting room. I'll put a link to a video up there just in case you're wondering what things we use. So common mistake number 6 is overwatering. Underwatering is also a problem, but I have found overwatering to be much more common than underwatering. And part of it is that we just care a lot about our little seedlings. We sort of love them to death by watering them too much. The ideal moisture level in a seed pot is partway between dry and fully saturated. And I've actually found the best way to test whether you have the right moisture levels is by weight. So when you pick these up, you can kind of feel, what does it feel like when it's completely dry, very light? And if it was fully saturated, how heavy would that be? And you want it to feel partway between that. Now, 20 years into gardening and seed starting, I have a pretty good sense of what that should feel like. But one thing you can do is actually just measure the weight on a little kitchen scale of, let's say, a pot that is completely dry. Just fill it with dry potting soil and then fully saturate it where the water's running out. Weigh that, and you're going to want your pot to be sort of halfway between that, ideally, as far as how much water to give. Seed starting material is very well draining by nature, however, so you do need to watch your seedlings carefully and adjust the amount of water that you give accordingly. If they're consistently bone dry the day after you water them, you may need to water them more. And the last common mistake that I see when people are new to seed starting is not hardening off your seedlings. So this parsley, for example, it's being kept in this incredibly protected area. There's no wind except for a fan that we usually have on, that I have off for the video. It's temperature controlled. It's basically always about 70 degrees in here. It's got this nice little container where I'm babying it along with just the amount of water that it needs. And it is just too sensitive to withstand the harshness of outdoors at this point. So when you're transitioning your seedlings to going outside, they need to have a process where they get used to the outdoor environment. That process usually takes about a week or so, where you putting the seedling outside in a semi-protected spot, usually some dappled shade with a little bit of protection, but not all protection from the wind. And you maybe do it for 2 hours the first day, and then just keep adding an hour or two every day until your seedling is used to the outdoors, and only then do you plant it out in its final place out in your garden. All right, that was the 7 most common mistakes that I have seen or have done when you are new to seed starting. Hopefully those mistakes you won't make this year because you've watched this video. Of course, there are many other little things that we've all done when we are going through the process of learning this incredibly fun and rewarding skill. So if you have any mistakes you've made or common mistakes that you've seen, let us know in the comments so all of us can read them and hopefully not do them ourselves. If you found this video useful, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button. And if you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing. We'd love to have you along. Happy gardening, everyone.